Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, we're sharing a recent interview with Kennedy Block and Josh MacPhee, editors of Strike While the Needle is Hot, a Discography of Workers Revolt from Common Notions Press. We speak about audio strike records, their role, what they tell us about the struggles they cover or were produced to amplify, and a bit about where music and popular resistance stand today. You should feel free to check our show notes for links, information about where you can get the book, about how you can follow the people that we spoke to and some of the other projects that they're involved with, as well as past interviews that we've done with them. So we're joined by the authors of Strike While the Needle is Hot, a Discography of Workers Revolt, Kennedy Block and Josh MacPhee. I wonder if y'all could introduce yourselves for the audience with your names, pronouns, and any other information you'd like to share about yourself.
What's up? Kennedy is great. And just fuck the RICO prosecution.
Hi, this is Josh MacPhee. I use he, him pronouns. And yeah, I mean, I guess just to say that this book is part of a ongoing process of about a decade of trying to kind of dig into and explore political music. And people can find some of that process in my last music-related book, an encyclopedia of political record labels, which is sort of a materialist analysis of the production of records for political and social movements. And so in a way, Strike While the Needle is Hot is kind of like a deep dive into one of those platforms.
When you say like a materialist approach, could you go a little bit deeper on, break that down a little bit?
Well, Kennedy is actually much more trained and schooled in music than I am. I'm on the border of tone deaf. So I am...
This is true.
Anything but an ethnomusicologist. Like I'm really looking at music as agitprop, and so the material structure around the music. Like I love vinyl records because not just because they're what I grew up listening to and the thing that got me into punk and all of these other things in the 80s, but because they come in a giant sleeve that is packed with all this extra information, and it's like an oversized canvas for artwork, and the kind of material objectness of the sleeve, the material in it, where the record was actually pressed, how it was distributed, all of those things can tell us an immense amount about the people who are doing that, whether that's a national liberation organization in Africa, or whether that's workers who are on a wildcat strike.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of in the title too. It's like an encyclopedia of political record labels, not of like political songs or musical styles. It's like this very specific piece,
right? Or a
discography
of Workers Revolt. We're really interested in how workers, both in unions, but a lot of them relatively autonomously, were using this form of the vinyl record as a pretty powerful form of agitprop that wasn't just about the songs. It was about using the songs beyond the picket line, because no one's playing a record on the picket line. They're just singing the songs, getting that out further, and the ways and tools that people do that, and what the benefits are to doing that.
I guess, as you mentioned, you had this encyclopedia that you had worked on, Josh, and this new book, the Strike While the Needle is Hot, talks about one of the aspects that you sort of covered or touched on in the other one. I wonder if you both could talk a little bit about the archival work that you've engaged with, pulling together the book, and like how you made the choices of what to include.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was thinking about this question because I feel like the best way to answer this is that, like, on the top level, this book, I think, comes out of this shared archival principle that, like, the best and perhaps only way to truly preserve something is to use it and to facilitate and to spread its use in one way or another. And so the book, just in its presentation and like what we focused on, it's focused on recirculating as much of this material as possible. So a lot of that is like just like as many photos and stuff as we can, putting together the mixtape, but also like tailoring the writing to like pulling out the kind of bits and the anecdotes that all together, I think, help to open up our contemporary imagination of what is possible and has invite us into just like continuing this as a style, as a part of a, sort of, like, I think the book tries to sort of show it as part of a repertoire, and what's sort of being archived is like, this like sense of what you can do and the possibilities there. But yeah, I feel like just the top line that this comes out of, just like the principle that use is preserving something. I mean, I'm like so dedicated to that. I think like to Josh's chagrin, I was circulating like bootleg copies of our own book like before it was out, like on like a printed out Google Doc. You know what I mean? Just trying to get it into the hands of as many people, like particularly the kind of musicians I know, because I don't know a lot of factory workers.
I think that in the ideal world, the book would have come with a record or like a set of 7 inches tucked into the sleeves, but unfortunately, we live under a capitalist copyright regime, and so there's this funny thing where we can write about these records, but we actually can't reproduce the songs without clearing the rights, and the rights of most of this music is in another world because the record label that put them out was ad hoc. The musicians are unlisted. So there's really no way to get the rights to most of this material. So it sets up this funny thing where like this archival project about music in which there's no actual music. Although Kennedy just mentioned it, we just finished a mixtape that is we're duping onto cassette because that generally flies under the radar, and and we'll have a digital download too that so people can listen to a lot of the music, because I don't know if almost any of it is on platforms like Spotify, and very little of it is on YouTube. So it is hard to hear, because these are kind of literally the records that fell through the cracks.
Yeah, and you were kind enough to point me to some of the tracks, so hopefully listeners will hear a little bit of that interspersed in this conversation. There's some cool, I was just listening to it beforehand and like going back through the book and finding, okay, this is on page 122 and this one's on like whatever. But, yeah, that's cool. I mean, were these things that came across your awareness because of the work of that encyclopedia, or were these records that you requested from friends in the archiving community or the radical art community to like, hey, have you heard of any of these sorts of albums? Could you send them our way? Or how did you find the material that's in the book?
It was a mix. I mean, I had kind of passively absorbed some of these records while I was collecting just for, in general, like just kind of hoovering up political records. And then my friend Chris, who was one of the founders of 56A, which was like one of the last anarchist info shops in London, sadly, he, out of the blue, mailed me this 7-inch record of Ford workers in the early 80s on strike in London. And not only is it a kind of incredible record for a number of reasons, and I'm pretty sure I sent you one of the tracks, Johnny Strika, but it really, like, at the time, it was a record that, like, there was no evidence of it online. It wasn't on Discogs, which is kind of the go-to site that catalogs music recordings. It wasn't on eBay. It just didn't exist. And so I was like, this is really interesting. Like, these workers who created their own autonomous workers organization outside of the union, and then used some of that power during a strike to produce a record, like, of all things, right? So that had me digging through my existing collection and finding these other examples that I hadn't really correlated together yet, and really made me think, this is something worth digging deeper into and exploring. And so that started kind of the hunt, where sending notes out to friends who were in Scandinavia or, in other places, saying, hey, do you know any of these records that came out of strikes? And then just like digging. digging online, digging in record stores, just trying to find anything that kind of looked like it could be one of these records. And then sometimes it was a flop, and then a lot of times there are these interesting records. And a lot of them are interesting politically, sonically, not so much. I mean, some of them are really cool, but some of them, how many times can you listen to the Internationale being sung by a chorus of people that aren't trained singers? So, they're not highly prized. So they're not records that are expensive to get. They're just hard to find because people aren't promoting them. So they've just kind of fallen by the wayside.
Can you talk a bit about what the concept of let me step that back. Did you all kind of create the idea of a strike record in the putting together of this book, or was this a pre-existing phenomenon where people were going into a labor struggle and they're like, it's time, like, who's going to make the strike record? And what sort of materials were going into that? Some of the records that you found here, like you listed off a few different types of content, like speeches or workers' choirs and whatever.
I feel like I could say a little bit to this because, and correct me if you feel like this is wrong, Josh, but it feels like kind of these different concepts of what is a strike record sort of, on one hand, it seems to exist as a practice that it's a thing that through the kind of given ecosystem of leftist focus on culture that has maybe waned over the past sort of 70 to 80 years of active assault on it. There was kind of unions had record labels or something, right? These political organizations had record labels, as you kind of talked about in the encyclopedia. But at the same time, I guess we also kind of make a distinction by only focusing on vinyl records. This is another kind of slice that pushes us in the organizational and infrastructural direction, because a vinyl record, as opposed to a cassette tape, for example, requires so much more coordination and organization to kind of get off the ground, and a commitment to a kind of scale that you don't need to have with a small run of sort of personally produced cassettes and things like this. And so that kind of ends up getting reflected in the content of the records. And I feel like, to me at least, what emerges after having worked on all these is kind of the idea that a strike record is sort of at base a form of active participation in a struggle, like others. But it's one that tends to focus on popularization, clarification of kind of political stakes, and circulation. So it's like a form of agitprop. But at base, what we kind of see in these records is people eschewing the distinction between protagonist and musician supporter, and just either just getting into the thick of it, playing on the picket lines, or producing sort of different musical styles that attempt to sometimes a little harshly kind of smash a Welsh choir with industrial music or something, but try to fuse it and try to build these different kinds of. But I don't know. So it's like a strike record ends up being, on one hand, a technique of struggle, like others, that focuses on a particular kind of range, but that is also not reducible to the music contained on the record. It's not, a strike record is not a certain kind of ditty or already known song like the Internationale. It's also just the collectives that produce the art, is the label that pressed the record, is the community studio that recorded it, and it's the sort of working class history and initiative of workers and musicians who are actually making the music. You know what I mean? So,
I mean, we catalog 80 records in the book, and we really tried to focus on and set some kind of boundaries that the vast majority of these records are records that were produced in part with workers' input, or on their behalf during or directly after a strike. So they're records of strikes, not records about strikes. There's some exceptions to that we included because for different reasons, and it doesn't really maybe matter here, but largely we sort of were trying to say that these are records that are of the strike. It's not a record that's let's write a song about a strike that happened 100 years ago and have a pop hit about. However unlikely that would be, that's not in our organizational system. That wouldn't be a strike record. What's interesting is that you do see the development of a self-consciousness in some ways about these records, but only in certain contexts. So, for instance, like Belgium is like a relatively small country in Europe that, at least in the United States, often gets forgotten about. And yet they're like heavily overrepresented in this book, in part because there's this group of musicians who call themselves GAM, Grupo Action Musicale, and excuse my pronunciation of all languages, even English. And they start in the early 70s, coming out of the left, like coming out of social movements, working with workers to produce records out of strikes. And that sets this template. So I think we include 3 of the records that they produced. And I'm pretty sure there's probably 2 or 3 more that we couldn't get our hands on. And we even had someone in Belgium who was like hunting for us and found like evidence of these other records, but just couldn't get them. So like they really set this template. And then we see that there's all of these other records that follow in the wake of that. And groups that style themselves in some ways like GAM. There's a group called Expression that produces a couple records with striking workers. So you see that the strike record, at least in Belgium, becomes a thing that people are conscious of and seem desirous to produce. As opposed to like in Germany, which is like a significantly larger country with a lot more workers, where there is a couple records, but there's not a lineage of them in the same way. In Italy, you have a lot of strike records, but they don't seem to be consciously thought of as separate from the records that come out of other social struggles.
Abbiamo trovato un metodo d'azione per romper meglio le scatole al padrone. È il sistema più rapido e moderno e che si chiama lo sciopero interno. Sciopero interno. Da dentro l'officina noi perdiamo poco e Agnelli va in rovina se si sta a scioperare dentro i cancelli. Chi ci rimette soprattutto Agnelli. Basta che siamo 200 scioperanti, tutta la Fiat non può più andare avanti, ci rimette la paga poca gente, ma tutti gli altri non producono niente. Sciopero interno,
caliamo il rendimento
ed abbassiamo
il cottimo giù a 100
che con lo scasso della produzione.
So, Italy in the late from Hot Autumn in '69 throughout the 1970s is this just like roiling bed of struggle. And so you have all of these there's just hundreds of political records that are coming out of Italy, and some of them are about strikes, and some of them are about housing occupations, and some of them are about militants that have been imprisoned, and doesn't seem to be any distinction between them. So there's a lot of strike records, but they're not seen as being elevated above other militant records. So I think that the place of the strike record is really contingent on the locale. And in the English-speaking world, the place where we really get a self-consciousness around strike records is in England in 84 or 85 with the miners' strike, where you've got dozens of records that come out. And we've collected, I don't know how many, 20 in the book, and my guess is there's another dozen that slipped through the cracks. There's just a real consciousness in the UK from that point forward around the record as this tool within labor struggles.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder how much that relates to or I guess maybe it just relates to like the conception of labor and organizing labor in distinct trade union structure versus the autonomous movement that was about breaking those boundaries. So the record in this case is like just a reflection of the general social struggle. I mean, I'm basically just saying the same thing that you just said, maybe. But that's interesting, though. Like, yeah, the autonomous movements. I see what you're getting at. Yeah, I guess since you talked about GOM as this sort of house band for the trade union movement, I guess maybe. Could you talk a bit about the performers? Like your introduction mentions Joe Glazer appearing on numerous of these records that you came across. I wonder if you have thoughts about who participated in these albums, how many were professionals who took up the task for a specific strike, how many were the workers themselves, and what sort of motivations you were able to uncover?
I mean, yeah, Joe Glazer is interesting because he's not actually on any of the strike records. He's just kind of like this mercenary that, you know, I'm assuming was in the CP, the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s, and kind of emerges in the 50s as the sort of like troubadour for the labor movement. And so he records, upwards of a dozen records for different unions where he like writes the theme song for, the UAW, United Auto Workers, and then like the theme song for the Longshoresmen. And then he records these records that are a mixture of these songs that he writes new lyrics to kind of classic labor songs that are fairly corny and specific to the union. So these aren't like struggle records. These are the kind of records that you would get handed out at like the national conference of the steelworkers, like the glorious history of the steelworkers in song. And these are not autonomous records at all. And so it's interesting that he's this figure that's associated with labor so profoundly within the music world. He doesn't touch these strike records. I mean, it's just not his world. And that's where the strike records are really interesting, because they show this tension between the unions, particularly the more the unions that really have developed intense and tacit kind of negotiation agreements with management to smooth over industrial militancy, versus like the more insurgent unions and the wildcat workers that produce a lot more of the records. The unions are producing these hagiographic records. The workers are producing these like the bosses records, and they're really different.
I think in terms of literal performers, the stuff that's collected in the book is like it's oftentimes just the workers themselves singing. Sometimes it's the workers performing with like on one of my favorite tracks, the local high school band. Sometimes it's these kinds of like, relatively avant-garde musicians like kind of mixing it all up. And sometimes it's also like established musicians from a kind of pop, ish mold lending their name. I don't know, Josh, you have that story about the guy who kind of just gets blacklisted after making his sort of 70s funk record about coal mining. So, not all the men, sort of, I don't know, it's like, you get oops, or like, there's a lot of, I don't know how to put it. It's not like you have to give something up to make a record like this in a sort of more legitimate vein, but they're, I think the ones that we were attracted to, yeah, definitely sort of, and you can hear it in the music oftentimes come from like a pretty strong, like, impulse or clarity or just like life. So despite the corniness, they can still be like very beautiful.
I think that who the performer is in these records also, you see it evolve over time. It's not like some singular path. It's sort of bounces around. But if we just, for sake of argument, split to like pre-1980 and post-1980, pre-1980, you're much more likely to put a record on and find that it's the workers themselves or a union choir, or like the music comes out of, is embedded in the community that the workers come out of. And that says, one, that them recording and hearing themselves is meaningful to them. And two, that community is large enough to support the production of 500 or 1,000 of these little black discs that then have to get distributed in the world. Around like in the late 70s and early 80s, you see this transition happen where increasingly, although never explicit, there is a question about, well, do we need to start producing songs in a more pop idiom in order to get a broader audience? And so that's when you start to see more external musicians come in. You start to see this breaking down or breaking up of the kind of community that would all share a song. And as that starts to disappear because of encroachments of, capitalist entertainment industry in part, as well as just assaults on labor in general, you get more and more records where you basically have pop songs that are either often relatively poorly done by the workers or kind of hired out people that are supporting the workers to do these songs that are rock songs or
electro,
like pop rap. And so there is a real change that happens. And I think that the reasons for that are not entirely readable off the records themselves, but I think we can infer that there is this kind of combination of the breaking down of the ties that hold the working class community together, so that the sort of folk idiom and working class song culture in which people teach their kids songs and they teach their kids songs. And so when you put those on a record, it everyone knows the songs and it validates you. That starts to have less meaning because kids don't want to learn those songs. They want to learn the Beatles or whatever. And so then you start to get these songs that sound more like the Beatles to varying effects. And then there is this interesting period, and you really see it in Belgium, like we mentioned, where you have these militant musicians who really align themselves with the workers, and they record with the workers, they write the songs with the workers. They're not writing songs about the strike. They're kind of really embedding themselves in the culture of the strike. And in some of the records, they actually write and talk about that, which is really interesting. The sort of affective sense of like, what does it mean to be a musician and part of this movement, and the need to involve workers and the need for workers to be allowed to be able to be musicians as well. And this real attempt at in recognizing that social struggle is about transformation of the individual and the community. And so they really get at, and I think it's in this transition point where it's the strongest, this real interrogation of who is the performer, which is the most interesting, I think, moment, is this when that's a question, not an answer.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. I really appreciate that. Like, I've been thinking a lot myself over the last few years about folk music and political folk music and the reproducibility of, like, I've been learning acoustic guitar, for instance, just because I've been inspired throughout my life by political folk music, and the idea that someone can just know the general tune. They might go and perform it with some friends in a totally, like a slightly different way than how it's recorded somewhere. But that moment where people share that song, share those lyrics, share the sentiments that are there, and make it their own in that moment. It's not the same as turning on Spotify and putting on a Beatles song. It's not calling back to you out of history as this like frozen moment of art. It's something that is mutable and something that is alive in the moment. And yeah, that's a really cool insight about that shift towards pop culture.
And like one more aspect of that kind of comes through in the records is, this is something that you've talked about before, Josh, but that like a lot of what we're seeing involves in some way an invitation, whether that's as simple as just like with a lot of these records, the lyrics and the lead sheet, the chords to the songs being included, such that, again, it's like it's being like circulated within an audience that is also not being asked or trained to think of themselves as a passive consuming audience.
When these were produced, I guess you've kind of already gone into this a bit, but I'm curious about like who the record was produced for. You've already talked about you've talked about this in a few ways, but if we could just talk a little more specifically, like how were the albums distributed? How much fundraising would actually come from these for the movement, for the strike? Did they get played on the radio during the struggles, or were they more as like souvenirs and quote unquote records of the moment and of the struggle?
I mean, some of that is not knowable by the records themselves, although there are some of the records give kind of like accounting of how many records were pressed and the expectation of the income that they'll make, and like we've prepaid this much into the strike fund, so we have a little bit of information, but some of it's relatively unknowable. I mean, we do know that it's unlikely any of these records were pressed in a volume less than 500 copies, because unlike, as Kennedy was saying, unlike cassettes or CDs, at the time you couldn't self-press a record. So they had to be industrially produced. So there had to be a level of investment to make that happen. We can, I would say 75% of the records in the book are 7 inches as opposed to LPs. And I think that the reason for that makes a lot of sense, that like strikes are often quite short. There's limited resources. So it's much easier to not only have the capital to put out a 7-inch, but to record the 12 minutes that you can fit on a 7-inch versus the 40 that you can fit on a 45 you can fit on an LP. The LPs are actually often quite extraordinary because they speak to like a much higher level of investment.
It's easy to forget that, the strike's lasting like a month, 3 months to put together all of it, like in a couple months is itself, even just for a 7-inch is kind of incredible in the pace that people are working at. And, I think it's probably evidence of the, the familiarity and sort of like see that,
it shows how one of the unintended side effects of being on strike is you have a lot more time.
Kind of an intended side effect, but
in the UK at least, a couple of the records make reference to, like the Ford record that we mentioned before says in really small type on the edge of the sleeve, "Will John Peel play this?" ? John Peel being the kind of famous BBC, like one of the only DJs that played popular music on the BBC, and was sort of a make or break DJ for music acts, popular music acts in the UK. So there is a kind of consciousness around the possibility of getting radio play. I do think, particularly like when we're talking about places like the UK where there's a really robust independent music scene, and you get these records coming out in the 80s in support of things like the miners' strike that are like Billy Bragg, or there's like Test Department is one of these industrial bands, the Redskins. You have these bands that likely those songs probably were played on the radio, but then you also have evidence of the record that Kennedy mentioned, that's from the early 70s. It's like the first British miners' strike record that we could find by John and City Lights, where John is actually this guy John Paul Jones, who he had a handful of hit pop records and was largely a stand-up musician. He was a comedian, but he felt very strongly about this miners' strike in 1972 and recorded this 7-inch that his label Polibio was going to put out, and then they refused to put it out, and then it got banned from the radio. And then he sort of disappeared after that. His career was tanked. His backing band City Lights went on to become the relatively popular kind of blues rocky band 10cc. So it didn't hurt their career, but they also weren't listed. So you get these different relationships to popularity. In Scandinavia, there were a number of quite popular groups that fell under this umbrella of term called prog, which, like we know, like prog rock, the origin of the term is similar in a way, but progressive in the Scandinavian context didn't just mean progressive musically, but explicitly meant progressive politically. So you had these folk bands that were playing much more complex progressive music increasingly that also were explicitly leftists. And some of these bands ended up being extremely popular, and they would record strike records in support of workers, and those more than likely got played on the radio, because some of these bands were the equivalent of like platinum selling if they had been Western Anglophone bands.
Well, and another sort of aspect of the popularization that is aimed at by some of these records is like not just in terms of like, you know, popularization in terms of what kind of audience you're cultivating, but also like to popularize a struggle amongst the working class or whatever, to sort of like go and off, you know, through face-to-face interaction, sort of like, you know, create the sense that, you know, your fight is my fight is your fight. So like, for example, another, I think, Belgian record, the Capsulaire, Viva, which was a record, again, an instance of a record that's supported by another kind of leftist institution, this radical magazine. That's the recording of a band that comes out of the factory, but who are just like, they're like really tight. Like they play extremely well together. They have some great songs. And what's documented on the sleeve is their travels to different factories to perform directly, acting as this kind of cultural unit that can bridge struggles to other places, you know, in the same way that I know bands can do this, other kinds of political cultural units can do this, like soccer teams, maybe, stuff like that.
Hello, Mr. Jefferson, this is your BT engineer. I thought you'd be home, so that's why I phoned to sing this in your ear. Now I've got this little problem, keeps running round my mind. How can you earn 200,000 pounds a year and only working part-time? Now my granny, who's a part-time child lady, said she'd like a job like you. In fact, if you find another charmant job, I would like it too. I'd even be one of your board members for 100,000 a year. But 5% of my wages, so George, really isn't fair. 5% on our wages, Georgie, really is unfair. You drive us out into the street to protest our pay claim. But the tactics you and the boys using, so George, makes me feel ashamed. Saying that technicians won't answer emergencies and they don't care. But when they arrive at the exchange to help, your boys won't let them in there. They're using the same blackmailing tactics they use on the nurse and the policeman, saying that our behavior can cause the public harm, but we only want what we work for. So I put it back to you.
Can you talk about how the tradition continues despite changes in the technology of sharing music? For instance, I've seen benefit compilations for social and ecological struggles like Stop Cop City and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, or anti-fascist action, or prisoner support movements over the years. Yeah, how has it changed since the days that you were recording in this book?
I mean, we mentioned before that, you know, the book goes up to about 1990, and part of the reason why we stopped there is because that's the point in which cassettes and CDs start to outsell vinyl records, and so you don't get strike records after that, because the whole point of the strike record is, on some level, to popularize a struggle. And so if people are listening to cassettes and CDs, then why would you put a vinyl record out? There isn't the kind of nostalgia within the workers for the vinyl record like there is in the punk scene, for instance. So, you know, first you see a shift to cassettes and then to CDs, and both are much easier to produce, and you can make 10 cassettes and just give them to, you know, workers on the picket line as a kind of like a morale booster. So we didn't dig that deep into these further kind of technical iterations because they're much harder to track. And because of their potential boutiqueness, it's hard to know whether one cassette was made or 10,000. And therefore, like, it just didn't seem worth tracking down and documenting a cassette that 5 copies were made just for the workers themselves, because that wasn't what the project was about. And then that kind of holds over to CDs. And then we move into, like, I think a lot of what you're talking about is these compilations that show up on Bandcamp, and that you can pay, a sliding scale of $10 to $30 to get like this massive download of songs that people donated in support of these struggles. And I think that those things are very cool, but one of the things that they often don't have is any of this architecture around them to educate anyone about those struggles. So because it's just ones and zeros, it's just data that you pull down on your computer or your phone, and then it just gets, sucked up into a algorithmic playlist that you have on whatever device. Then it kind of gets detethered from the struggle. A lot of times the songs aren't about the struggle. They're just donated to try to get people to buy, which is good. It's important that people have ways and reasons to support these struggles, but there's less of that kind of sense of a whole package. And so I actually I look forward to people trying to kind of go, I don't know, we can't go backwards, but certainly to kind of go forwards and try to think of new ways to create music and sounds to support struggles that have context embedded in them in ways that when you listen, that they have an itness, that kind of connects you to the politics rather than just this ethereal relationship.
I think for me, when I try and sort of look at contemporary iterations of this book, I think of the struggle against Cop City, mainly because it's a struggle in which the sort of vast array of autonomous crews that were kind of working to push the struggle forward. What seems like the most interesting part in what the struggle offered was that these people took on the political responsibility of communicating the struggle, and of kind of creating. I mean, we did kind of an exhibition at Interference, and something that came out is just the vast amount of in this instance writing, but the vast amount of attempts to popularize and to sort of communicate the meaning and the needs of this struggle, and to take responsibility for that in zines and writing, but also treating the media, the mainstream media or whatever, as a terrain that you can make operations on, not making an ethical judgment about being for or against it, but treating it as part of this sort of field that as someone legitimately trying to kind of form narratives and bring people in that again, just that it's a terrain that you do things on. So there were things popped up we see in this book. You have independent organs for the struggle, like Atlantic Community Press Collective, that starts doing kind of research that supports other kinds of efforts, and it's a situation in which the kind of there's this tone in which there's the free giving away of authority to anyone interested in participating in the struggle, mainly through the technique of just non-condemnation. But there's just this kind of active tone of you are a political actor, you have the authority to organize in your sort of zone towards this, and it helped kind of create this ecosystem that feels to me the most akin to kind of what we see in the book, or we're interested in the book, that allows for all these kinds of experiments to happen. And that part of the kernel, and what I would take from the book and keep moving forward, and how I would want to think about music moving forward, is is this investment of agency and authority to just for anyone involved to start working on it. So there's there's stuff like that, but also just within the Cop City struggle, there being just organized attempts at using music as a tool of getting people in. So the most sort of famous example being the series of raves and then music festivals inside of the occupation, which is part of a kind of placemaking strategy, a strategy of building participation in the movement that had, I think, severe limitations that I don't really know how to speak to properly, but that were just incredibly exciting. There's something that a lot of my thinking about this is influenced by a variety of things, but also if you go into freejack.co, this is the support website for Jack Mazurek, who's facing some basic charges after a series of home raids. But there's a zine on there that you can download called Free Jack, Feed the Airwaves, that kind of works through this idea of what it is to be sort of a militant musician. And they're not just sort of defining music as something you do to support a struggle, but that like you as a musician, like if we understand our struggles contemporarily, whatever, as like paradigmatic struggles between like a world of death and a world of life, you know, sort of like your ability to like, I don't know, freely develop your expression and even just to literally make noise in public is like attacked and impinged upon through a variety of legal and extra, you know, force means. And so they're like, you already have a stake in the struggle and whatever. So there's like good writing on that. But then there's also, and I've kind of gone on a lot about Cop City, but I kind of want to read, we include in full a flyer from the 5th week of action in the forest that was circulated during this music festival that I'm talking about. And I kind of want to, if possible, just read it, and then maybe Josh or Burst, if you have thoughts about the ways in which this kind of sketches something that's actually pretty different than what we're talking about, or whatever, you know. But it'll probably take like a minute or two. Is that okay? So this is not a music festival because we are not here as consumers or as mere spectators. This is not another photo op, another networking opportunity. We are here because our need for a free forest, culture, and existence can't be crushed by the police, nor can it be sold back to us as an image in an uninspired Hollywood ripoff. In a cave called Dvizhbabe, I think, located in present-day Slovenia, archaeologists have recently discovered a 60,000-year-old. The human need for music has been with us since the very beginning. We are here to affirm that this deep and timeless desire, which has survived an ice age, the rise of empires and states, the advent of borders, slavery, war, famine, and holocausts, is an important part of the current struggle. This movement is not just about a piece of land. It is not being fought between the police and their goons on one hand and some activists and their friends on the other. We are witnessing the collision of two competing ideas of life and the future. If they win, they will pollute all the rivers, destroy all of the forests, pave over everything beautiful, and they will use the police to assure unlimited profits as our civilization chokes out its dying breaths. If we win, human needs will be measured against the imagination, against our collective ambitions and dreams, not held hostage by a system of artificial scarcity and waste. Our communities will not be held together by their ability to kill and maim enemies or heretics. They will be held together by music and the ability to generate common luxuries. So let's not say, oh, they don't really care about the struggle, they are only here for the party, or this is not about music and festivals and all of this crap. This is about serious politics and organizing. Instead, let's say the truth. This is only a glimpse of what we could give one another if we manage to outlive the oil-based economies of the current world system. The emancipation of the senses, the free development of the imagination and the passions. This is precisely what we are fighting for.
Then the no Cop City, no Hollywood dystopia.
Period.
Yeah. It's interesting. I forget sometimes about the fact that they were planning a movie studio too on the spot, and not just the Cop City facility too. Yeah, Josh, I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that.
Let me go back a second. You know, I grew up and was politicized through punk, like a lot of my peers, and within that paradigm, punk was presented as being kind of the inverse of, or the antagonist to folk music. And so I had no experience listening to, understanding, or even really knowing what folk music was until relatively recently. Like, it wasn't until I started working on the encyclopedia, and in particular had old, like, movement elders give me records, and listening to them and realizing, oh, folk music means people's music. Like, folk is people. Like, it's not, you know, Joan Baez is not people. That, like, there's folk traditions all over the world. They sound extremely diverse. They're not all the same, although they can overlap. And so that, you know, has sent me down this rabbit hole of, like, being, like, extremely interested in folk music and extremely interested in this idea of, like, what it feels like to be in a community in which music is just part of it. It's part of that community. It's just part of who you are and what you do. You all know songs and you sing them together. And we've fundamentally lost that for the most part. And I think that what's nice about this political angle within the Stop Cop City struggle is this attempt to figure out how to reclaim that. I think that's going to be harder to do than what we would think. Like, we're so polluted / enamored by pop music, but also it's interesting because when you were reading that flyer, Kennedy, I was thinking about Glastonbury and how, like, Glastonbury, the huge music festival in the UK, which actually started as a free festival that was like by people who just sort of traveled around and squatted the land and then played like these massive, like, there's massive concerts with Hawkwind and, all of these jammy space rock bands that were hyper political, is now like super corporate. Yet you have these people like Kneecap or Bob Vylan who in some ways embody the very thing that Flyer is against, yet just them speaking up about Palestine has led to them being like banned from countries, facing criminal charges. So it's interesting. Like, we live in an ecosystem in which clearly music is a powerful terrain of struggle. And there's lots of ways to struggle on that terrain. And so I really like this idea of trying to create these autonomous, very DIY music projects. But I also don't want to stop the Kneecaps of the world from using a platform that they have to say things. I don't think that that's the world we want to live in which there's people who are famous and we listen to them and what they say makes it more important than if someone else says it. But it is, whether we want to live in that world, it is the world we live in. So I feel like if there's a way to somehow like do that and undo it at the same time. And it's interesting. I think that in the records around the miners' strike in the mid 80s in the UK, you see that tension. You see people like Paul Weller from the Jam and Style Council. He created this kind of supergroup called the Council Collective to record this record to raise money for striking miners. And it's like, it's a dance record. It's made to be played on the radio and in the club. And there's this long format apologia on the back that you see, like, there's these musicians who they want to support the struggle, but they function at a level in which there's so many people that need to sign off on what they do in order to get a record to come out, that when this record finally comes out, on the back, there's this long form apology about the fact that some striking miners dropped a cinder block off an overpass and hit a cab that was carrying scabs to the workplace, and people were injured. And it's almost embarrassing, like this sort of like, we want to support struggle, but not the way that workers are actually struggling. Like, we want to support some idealized version of how workers are going to struggle, in which everything is clean and simple and no one gets hurt. We need to figure out ways to start to kind of unpack that, to like encourage the Kneecaps, but also hold a sort of accountability to, it is not the musician's role to decide how workers are going to struggle, or how Palestinians are going to struggle, or how people organizing against Cop City are going to struggle. And to sort of like invite, like that flyer was saying, invite as many people in as possible. If some massive pop star wants to support Cop City, then that's great, but they don't get to decide what that struggle looks like. And it's great because these records embody some of that tension, these early attempts at trying to hash that out and figure out how to do that.
And one thing that seems to help in all these instances is just that, like, the priority here is that there's action happening. I think people are struggling and doing things. You know what I mean? That with all these strike records, the basis is that there is a strike going on. And like in Cop City, that. Okay.
Oh, there's something at stake.
Yeah.
Something very real.
Yeah, I think we kind of like learn that in the development of these kinds of cultural and political ecosystems, that like some of the values that one can take are that, sort of like leading with bold action is one of your strongest friends. I mean, that's like the struggle against Cop City started simultaneously with an info night, sort of like a public sort of preempting of the city's narrative of how this facility was going to be constructed in the park, had a bunch of people. And then that night, construction equipment was burned. So it's sort of like that, and or like in the George Floyd uprisings in 2020, like within the first week, a police precinct, I think within the first week, extremely soon, a police precinct is burned to the ground. You know what I mean? Strong action, bold action, and experiments create ecosystems around them. Action begets organization, almost more so sometimes than organization begets action. And so we have that, and then just this kind of like basic principle of like not approaching struggle as like a primarily ethical problem, as a place in which one should sort of like find and police bounds of purity, whether that's your ideology or like the mode of struggle. And then just to kind of like, I don't know, this one's perhaps the sloppiest and the one I don't know the most about, but just like non-condemnation, just like everybody's running for it. That one's like really hard in practice, but as a kind of set of principles of unity and stuff like this, I mean, I feel like this is the direction that we see supporting the most dynamic ecosystems of sort of like militant struggle that we've seen in the past 5 years at least, probably more. And music, I don't know. But throw music in there somehow. I feel like we've already spoken for a lot of thoughts.
Well, I guess getting back to the book and the way that you curated it, I mean, obviously you had a bigger volume of records to pick through, I'm sure, than you put in here because it was curated. But were there any records in particular that struck you as notable, the performers or the art or the content of the album or the inserts that you were able to find?
I mean, one of the big ones, which Kennedy mentioned in passing, is this record by the Hindle Pickets and TBE, which was produced in the Midlands in the UK just before the miners' strike, actually. And the Hindle Pickets are pickets from the Hindle Gear Factory. So it's like a kind of workers' choir that is a tradition in the UK. And they work at this gear factory, and I believe it's in Bradford. And TBE was, from what we can tell, a high school band. Some of them may be the kids of the workers. There's nothing. They never released anything else, and there's nothing specific about the band other than the musicians' names in the record. But it's this incredible mashup of these young kids that obviously are like listening to a lot of like Wire and Gang of Four and the Buzzcocks. It's like this very like post-punk kind of sound, and then these guys who are just like a workers' choir, and they put out this song Year and a Bit, which is this sort of like drony post-punk backbeat with this worker narrating affectively what it feels like to be on strike. And it's like extremely arresting.
This is the first time I've been on strike in my life. My only wish was to earn enough to support my children and my wife. We've been out for a year and a bit. We're fighting and we dare not quit. Will not quit. Line is a lonely place with wind and rain in your face. Cowboy drivers going in helped by the law, and all we've got is a driving snow. If you ask for higher pay, you are told to go away. Go away. We may be right and we may be wrong, but still it shouldn't take this long.
It's a pretty incredible record, like both politically and as a pop record. And so that one is really a standout. And then in addition, it's one of those records that's just jam-packed with little pieces of paper. It's got like a whole sheet about how they produced the record, and then it's got a letter from Neil Kinnock, who's like the head of the National Union Miners at the time, I think, or he's the Labour Party liaison with the unions in support of the strike, and then there's a history of the strike and why they went out on strike and ways to support. And there's just like, it's really chock full of information. It's one of these great things where you're like, I'm not just listening to this great record, but I'm learning in almost minutia about the history of this struggle. And that's a real standout, and in a way is very similar to the Ford record that we mentioned, which is another record that kind of is embedded with all this paratextual information so that you can really learn about the strike. And so like those are two really good examples. I don't know if Kennedy, you want to throw a couple more in.
It's kind of hard to, we've been like sitting with them for a while now. I know that in like making the mixtape, I was particularly surprised by how much some of the picket line ditties stuck in my head. So this is just like the women's choir of the Curlsy Pit, just kind of just in the most sort of block-headed English, tone. Just kind of, you won't find us at the kitchen sink. You won't find us at all. Come on over to the picket line. We'll be picketing there. Just like boom, boom, boom. Like, but I can't get it out now. So it's effective for what it was attempting to do, which is regulate a means of kind of hanging out together. I mean, I know that also just like doing this book has also just kind of made other elements of my life stick out to me more. So like I don't know, like recently had the sort of pleasure of being involved in, I guess what they were calling a morale. So it's like some comrades have come back from Rojava with all these kinds of kind of intense ideas about like sort of culture and like the development of struggle and things like this, and they kind of help to facilitate just this kind of like night of revolutionary music, which is not something I'd ever experienced before, but that was like immediately so easy to just kind of, it's in a barn, some straw on the ground, some like twinkle lights, and people like singing, sort of like IRA songs that like everybody starts stamping to and hooting and hollering, and it kind of like, I don't think I would have kind of had as much of a way to get into and sort of ingest and care about and feel sort of wrapped up in this music without kind of spending time. So I don't know, it's a cycle. They kind of reinforce one another, and I found myself having more and more fun coming back to the records.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's worth mentioning that there's this really interesting record we found from, it's the last record in the book. It's from 1990, and it was put out by a union called CITEC, which is from Curacao, which is like a country that I don't know a ton about, but Curacao has a very like complex linguistic mix because of a history of colonization, and it's a full LP that seems like it's documenting a 1990 like union gathering, but also there's a big strike that happens at the same time, and it's unclear whether they just go on strike every year. And so maybe this is one of many records documenting their strikes, but the record, although it lists tracks, it's not tracked. So people that are familiar with vinyl records, it's just one long song, one long audio track that completely seamlessly intersperses field recordings out on the street, meetings, people giving speeches, and then there's this amazing moment in the record where this call and response starts up, where someone breaks from a speech into this chant that is just like the most incredible, like polyrhythmic call and response.
It's not free Palestine, free Palestine. It's like it's like really
and it's all a cappella. I mean, it's incredible. So that record actually is a real standout, even though we're still trying to parse exactly what's going on it, because it switches from multiple languages without any contextual clues, and But that's a real interesting and fascinating record. Another really great record is one of a couple that came out of the struggle in the Lip factory. And Lip was a watch company, and the watches were built on the border between France and Switzerland. Classic kind of watch territory, long history of anarchist watchmakers. But in part, in a kind of response to May 68, the culture of the workers really changes in the late 60s, early 1970s. And in the early 1970s, the workers not only go on strike, but occupy the factory and kidnap some of the bosses. And there's this record that they self-produce where they have this militant chanson singer, Claire Martin Michon, who on the record is just listed as Claire, who is present for and listens to and sort of takes notes during all of their meetings and writes songs based on their meeting notes. And then this record is these songs that are like maybe the only record ever that's like songs about meetings, and then interspersed with workers talking. And then she takes this show on the road and travels around France giving concerts and selling watches from the occupied watch factory to support the workers. So this is like pretty incredible. Like, it's not just like a piece of plastic. It's this document of a very dense social process and struggle that like the record is like, it's a 7-inch, but it's in this oversized sleeve that unfolds and has like cartoons in it and all this information about the strike. It's pretty great.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, I feel like the slogan. Yeah, like the slogan of a lot of this stuff could just be just like it just keeps going, just keep going, like it just keeps folding into new activity. That's sort of the ethos of it, you know. Like I know I was thinking of another like conversation recently where it's just like kind of like, you know, the ethos of an organization should not be to preserve itself, but to just sort of like go for broke, you know, and in the process it's probably dissolve itself and become new things. And that feels like it happens over and over again in the process of these records. So people are, going for broke. And what that means is preserving like a kind of underlying activity and culture, perhaps more so even than just, you know, this or that band.
And like so many of the records are about a specific strike, but they document a kind of sediment of struggle. So that like it's about a specific set of demands or a strike, but you can see that all of these other people and all these other struggles participated in the construction of that. Like there's another incredible record that was put out by the strikers at Chasson, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, but it's a French bus manufacturer. And they work with this group Germinal, which is kind of like a jazz rock, kind of youthful seeming jazz rock act that actually writes a manifesto in the 7-inch about what it means as musicians to participate in the struggle. And they record a song that's specifically about this strike, but that's on one side of the record. But the other side of the record is a field recording of the picket line. And these, like the Chasson factory, the workers in part go out on strike for a set of reasons and conditions, but the thing that pushes or breaks the camel's back, so to speak, is the bosses lock them out. And so they create this massive picket to stop the bosses from allowing the chassis of the buses to leave the factory. So they're basically blocking the bosses from running the factory without them. And they can't do that themselves because there's not enough workers. But there's another strike going on in Lyon at the time. It's the cable makers, who are mostly Moroccan. And so they come to support the strikers. So there's these French-born lorry chassis makers, and then you have these Moroccan workers who come. And the French strikers have like a big band, like a kind of classic workers band. And then the Moroccan musicians come with all these North African instruments. And it's like this, I don't know, the record's like this 6.5-7 minute jam on the picket line of them playing together. And it's incredible. And it just shows the sort of levels of solidarity that get embedded in these struggles that you wouldn't know if this record wasn't still there to pick up and find and to show and document that struggle. And then the cover of the record is this like sort of screen printed, very like rainbow rolled, very graphic image that, you know, like there's no way it would exist if there hadn't been the student and worker strikes in 1968. So it's like clearly drawing on that struggle as well. So you can kind of see how these histories of struggles intertwine to make these moments of militancy. And the records are these objects that are windows into that.
The bit that you were referencing that was written on the sleeve, you know, they sort of describe what you described in the kind of last paragraph is the party will last all day, referencing this, you know, sort of face-off with the riot police. The first side of the disc, recorded on site, captures one of the most enthusiastic moments. Thanks to the contact established during the strike, in particular with comrades from the strike committee, we created a song which tells the story on the B-side, Long Live the Chasson Strike. As for us, and as much as possible, in liaison with other cultural groups, we intend to continue this type of work, minus errors and inadequacies, where the people live, work, struggle, and express themselves, so that a culture will be created which belongs to them and bears witness to their multiple battles against the economic, political, and cultural oppression. It's like a little more like inherent, but I think it's like this is the.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Long live the strike.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. When you were talking about that just dug it a little deeper into me of just how these aren't just documentations of the moment or agitprop of the, you know, the individual struggle that they're documenting or whatever, but also you can see the seeping in of what people are bringing, the culture, the demands, the desires that situate those specific struggles too, right? And that, like, yeah, I don't know. That's really interesting. That's really cool.
Well, and you see this it's interesting tension between like in like writing like that, and even in some of the music, where there's people are coming out of these communist traditions that have these very didactic ways of articulating and communicating struggle, but they're in these moments of like profound social transformation where the strike isn't just about a higher wage, but it becomes about a new way of life, where that didactic kind of like your dad's Communist Party way of communicating can't contain the energies of the struggle in the community. And that is interesting and exciting to kind of see that stuff continually like break down, that history is important and people are drawing from it, but they're really trying to build something new and figuring it out by doing.
You pointed to a few of the like interesting labor struggles, like the watchmaking factory, for instance, or this cross-industry, cross-cultural like solidarity that was being shown at the chassis making factory. Were there any other labor struggles that you hadn't heard about that piqued your interest that you came across when you were researching for the book?
Do you want to go? Or you want me to?
I mean, it's there's a lot. The only thing that's like really just like picking into my mind right now is this like anecdote from the Gainers meatpacking strike in I think Alberta, somewhere in Canada,
West Coast of Canada.
Yeah, they were. It's just very small, but it's like a lot of different techniques. One of the techniques of their strike was also an organized boycott of Gainers meat, and that didn't just mean like, don't buy it. Workers and their families would go into grocery stores, put little stickers on the Gainers meat in the store saying like, this is scab meat, and then they just poke little holes in the cling film so the meat went off. It's like, I don't know, it just kind of helps me think about sort of like what it actually means to run a boycott, when you're sort of serious about it and when you have an organized base that actually is in relationship to the product. So not just being like, don't buy it, Home Depot. Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning that there's a number of records that are not just labor strikes, but clearly like feminist struggles. And there's like a lot, like particularly because we're looking at a lot of the stuff is the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And like there's a lot of minor struggles and these kind of like traditional conceptions of a kind of blue collar masculinity. But there's a surprising number of records that came out of much more factories run by women. And there's this great record from the Obsession factory in the mid 70s, which was a lingerie factory. All women's garment workers go on strike, and they sort of promote the strike and the record by calling it the story of O's obsession, with the O being really big, playing off of, at the time, the soft porn story of O was like a big movie that was like in all the, the box offices across Europe. It was like a blockbuster film. And so they're kind of playing off this question of sexuality and making lingerie to kind of popularize their strike. And there's a number of examples of these women's struggles where there's a real consciousness around kind of feminist intervention into the realm of like workers' struggle.
There's another one. When we looked at the punk record DOA, their 7-inch general strike, it's referencing like something I had no idea happened, which was like this sort of development and near sort of pulling off of a general strike in Canada in the late 80s. That I don't know, just sort of surprised me with the early 80s. Surprised me with its breadth.
It's actually the only punk record in here that, for being like conceptualized as this like paradigmatic political musical form, I think there's something about the kind of like individualism rooted in it that made it difficult probably for punk bands to figure out a way to embed themselves in, or really like be close enough to strikes to really be able to participate in a meaningful way. So it was sort of surprising that this DOA record is literally the only punk record in the book, and that this record is also the only record that self-consciously advertises itself as limited edition.
Seemingly also because it kind of came out after like one of the main leaders of the Solidarity Coalition that was kind of like tying up all these different sectors and sort of like pushing for kind of like political demands for this general strike. He's like on the picket so much that he gets pneumonia, and then the person who like replaces him sells everyone out in sort of backroom deals essentially. But that means that the kind of strike basically kind of ended as soon as this record came out also. So it's kind of like, the production timelines are pretty difficult. But yeah, it is funny that there's this sense of like trying to back capitalize on it.
One that, and at the exact same time that record comes out, or at least maybe just a little bit before, there's a general strike in Ecuador. And one of the most kind of popular musicians in Ecuador, this guy, Polibio Mayorga, who's put out hundreds of records, produces this record called La Huelga, Viva La Huelga, which is this incredible like cumbia song that's so all good. Like support the general strike. Mm-hmm. And it actually is like so much more effective than the DOA record. Mm-hmm.
Viva la huelga! Viva! Que viva la huelga, carajo! Es hora del trabajador. Que viva la huelga, carajo! Es hora del trabajador. Abajo las oligarquías, arriba la revolución. El pueblo en su gran rebeldía demanda justicia y honor. Unidos los puños activos, luchemos con fuerza y valor. Unidos los puños activos, luchemos con fuerza y valor. Vencer o morir en bandera, que siempre y mañana mejor. Que viva la huelga, carajo, es hora del trabajador.
Which is like another thing in hindsight of like looking back to my like 16-year-old self who was just like, yeah, punk is their only political, this is the real music, and how like punk can do the sonic qualities of music are only as politically relevant as the way the music is used, right? And it feels like the Huelga record is something that like people all across Ecuador could bump and be super into. The DOA record, pretty small audience.
Yeah. Have you all seen the more recent documentary on on Chumbawamba that came out recently? There's like, if you watch some of the documentaries that have come out about Chumbawamba's early history, they have my understanding is that Chumbawamba formed partially out of this, or one of their early iterations was this project called Chimp Eats Banana, and they were just like putting together a benefit for the miners' strike, and they were short on bands, and so they're like, well, I guess what should we name ourselves? Okay, we'll do this. Picked up instruments, didn't play very well. They did eventually put out an album that's pretty entertaining, but if you can see footage of the punk bands performing at strike events, and you just see like punks and goths thrashing out on the stage, and the rest of the people are just kind of like wandering away during it, absolutely not speaking to the people that are actually participating in the labor element of it.
Yeah.
Right to cut you off, Kennedy.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's funny. It reminds me of we watched one of the records. Seems to be sort of from the 1984 UK or 1982.
No, it's 84. It's the same thing that Chumbawamba was. I think Buff talks about going onto the picket line and trying to figure out how to engage.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's like we were watching this documentary by Ken Loach called "Which Side Are You On?" and it's kind of, the cover looks exactly like the cover of a record that we have called "Which Side Are You On?"
Yeah, there's basically a soundtrack.
Yeah, which again, as we've been hitting, it's not phrased as a question. It is just which side are you on? That's it. No question mark, no period. Just like you already know. And there's a recording in there of just
Charlie Livingston.
Charlie Livingston's like, get off your knees, stand up and fight like our fathers did before. And
folk song.
It's fine, yeah. And it's like within the idiom, presumably, but it's just a room full of just the most stone-faced, like uninterested people. You know what I mean? But then it continues, and then like one of those people in the audience gets up and performs a poem that they wrote, and people are more into it. And I think one of our recordings also comes from that on the mixtape. That's like extremely raucous, like sort of like fiddle sing along, and that just keeps evolving into new songs for like a solid.
It's like a striking hootenanny.
Yes, no, exactly. Seriously, for a minute and a half, they're just going, "Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go."
Like football chanting.
Yes, no, yeah, it is.
Everyone loves to sing along. So.
Yeah. So there's other.
But all of that to say is, I think that the miners audience in '84 was a tough audience for any musician, not just the sloppy punk band.
Yeah. But like also, as you were saying, Josh, there's like you have that anecdote about so it's like if we're taking seriously that it is not just really not necessarily the content of the music that kind of creates its political impact or whatever. There's the example of another brick in the wall, which in sort of our context is perhaps a relatively fine sort of onboarding point to think about how stuff's kind of a little
Pink
fucked.
Floyd?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that in South Africa is like banned, like jail if you play that song. Josh, I feel like you can.
Well, yeah, I mean, it became banned in South Africa because students who were going on strike were singing "We Don't Need Your Education," teacher. So they took the chorus as a chant, and so it led to being banned, which was of course not Pink Floyd's intention. And so there's this interesting thing in which, on some level, it's the struggle that defines the meaning of the music rather than the musician.
100%, yeah. that's like, as I know this is something you think about as like a designer within political spaces too, that it's not like you don't get to just pick any old, symbol, invest with all the meaning autonomously as an artist, and then poof, there it is. It's like we're always working with a given kind of language, and that it's defined by the ways in which it is used and the power in which it accrues. And so it's like the real effectiveness of like political symbolism or music is like what it is able to enforce as its meaning. You know what I mean? And not just kind of like what you want it to be. I mean, this is kind of related, but I feel like I remember like in 2020 in New York City, there was just this period in which like it was like, the Bible verse where it's like, and they put blood upon the lintel and upon the mantle and God passed over them or whatever. It's like restaurants seriously treated like a handmade Black Lives Matter sign as like blood on the lintel, to let God pass by.
The Passover.
Yeah. Yes, no, it's like there was an enforcement of that slogan. It was not just like because it really hit or whatever. It's because through action people were really kind of
as it should be.
Yeah, as it should be.
Well, so you've already kind of mentioned the mixtape idea. I guess, should we talk about that if you're worried about like flying under the radar? I don't know.
No, that's fine. I mean, we're producing a small number of mixtapes, a couple hundred, that have 24 tracks, 12 on each side, that are sort of mixed together, edited versions of songs from the book. And the actual physical cassette of that will be available soon. And we'll also are going to link a digital download of that on the book page on our publisher's website, commonnotions.org. We'll also probably be on the Just Seeds website for the page for the book. So you'll be, if you're a object fetishist like I am, you'll be able to get an actual cassette. And then if you just want to hear the songs, you'll be able to download the mixtape. And that'll be if you go to Common Notions and search for Strike While the Needle is Hot, you can find it, or the same with justseeds.org.
Yeah, and I'll link that for sure in the show notes for this. So any listeners, when this comes out, check that out. You were also mentioning a coupon code.
Yes, for at least probably a week or two after this broadcast. So like in the summer of 2025, if you go to commonnotions.org and buy the book and use the code at checkout, strike 15, all caps, 15, the numeral 15, you get 15% off the book.
Josh and Kennedy, thanks so much for this conversation. Is there anything we didn't touch on that comes to mind right now? Lingering albums?
I mean, we kind of went all over the place.
Yeah, it was good.
It was nice.
It was great. If anyone listening knows of or has another Strike record, get in touch. We'd love to hear about more. And also, it's always great to get feedback. So let us know what you think of the book, and let us know any ideas that you have. And I think that both of us are really interested in trying to help facilitate ways that music and culture can be more impactful within our movements. So
how can people best reach out? Like Instagram or an email? Or
good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm on Instagram. It's at JMacPhee, MacPhee, or email is josh@justseeds.org. And you can reach Kennedy through me because he's much more stealth in his communications than I am.
If you go to the corner of
at 2 o'clock in the morning,
totally.
Bring a falafel.
Friends everywhere.
Sure.
I feel like the only other thing is that the RICO cases are starting up in Atlanta. Ayla King's speedy trial just had its first sort of, meeting and then was immediately delayed. And so it looks like the kind of first set of like trial groupings for our friends will begin. And we've been given a gift. This is a point of concrete continuation and participation in one of the fiercest struggles of our era. And we owe it to our friends and to ourselves to shape the terrain that we will fight on in the next 20 years by fighting these cases. So make a plan to go to Atlanta, organize your band to go to Atlanta, organize your soccer group to go to Atlanta, organize your queer line dancing group to go to Atlanta, and make a carnival out of the cases and build connections, and also bring a tape recorder, because there are already punk bands playing outside of the courthouse. So let's start putting it together.
And I think similarly, like we just saw the sanitation and city workers in Philadelphia forced to go back to work after being on strike for a number of weeks. I think we're headed for a couple hot years of labor unrest. And so support workers on strike in any way. Like go to the picket line and offer to help out. Get involved. If you're in a union, start to mobilize your fellow workers to support other workers and use music. Get people coming out. Get that boombox out on the line.
If the city you're in has another sanitation strike, be like up against the wall and pick up all that trash and bring it straight to like City Hall or like a rich neighborhood and just dump it there. Okay,
has to go somewhere. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Build barricades.
Mm-hmm. We are not promoting any illegal activity. No, that's awesome.
It's just trash.
It's just trash.
No, recently in New York, people, have thrown a bunch of trash in front of immigration vans, and trash alone is not enough to stop a speeding van trying to ruin people's lives.
But in LA, we learned that burnt out self-driving cars are enough to stop ICE vehicles.
I don't actually know what the lesson.
Temporarily.
Like, what was the lesson from the Waymo blockade? Except that it's sick. I don't know. That's funny.
Nail strips are a little more effective, but if they're thrown in with your trash, then best of both worlds.
Yeah.
But yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for being in conversation and for sharing this book. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get a book.
Amen.
Go get a book.
And I'll be sure to link again the Interference Archive podcast featuring some of those communiques from Cop City.
Stop Cop City.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Great.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. And now, some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
According to media reports, at approximately 10:37 p.m. on July 4th, 10 to 12 people dressed in black tactical gear began shooting fireworks and vandalizing the Prairie Land Detention Center in Alvarado, Texas. Prairie Land is an ICE facility. It appears that some of the people were shooting off fireworks as a diversion, while others vandalized the facility with graffiti and damaged vehicles in the parking lot. An Alvarado cop showed up and got shot. According to the U.S. Attorney, another of the so-called assailants fired 20 to 30 rounds at the facility correction officers. They all fled the scene but were later apprehended. Investigators later found 12 sets of body armor, 2 AR-15 rifles, spray paint, a flag that said "Resist Fascism, Fight Oligarchy," and flyers that said "Fight ICE Terror with Class War, Free All Political Prisoners." They also recovered fireworks, more weapons, and cell phones in multiple subsequent searches. One of those detained is identified as Megan Morris. All of those apprehended were charged with attempted murder of a federal officer and 3 counts of discharging a firearm in relation to a crime of violence. ICE's online propaganda includes a quote from ICE Director Todd M. Lyons saying, "This escalation in violence is incomprehensible, and those responsible will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law." That posting also notes that ICE agents face a 700% increase in assaults as activists masquerading as immigrant advocates continue impeding ICE operations. In response to all of this, I've written an open letter to the director of ICE. Here's how that goes. Dear Todd, I note in an online posting that you are confused by what you have called an incomprehensible escalation in violence. You seem perplexed as to why this is happening. I'd like to explain it to you. There is a violent and dangerous gang that each year kills more people in the United States than all other gangs combined. They kill more people than mass shooters. They kill more people than terrorists, plane crashes, and natural disasters combined. That gang is called law enforcement. Now, you'll recall that last fall there was a contentious election and Donald Trump won. He's now engaged in what appears to be payback, flooding the cities of those states that didn't vote for him with all kinds of law enforcement, the most murderous gang in America. When that law enforcement shows up, they're not delivering hugs and bunny rabbits, Todd. They're wearing tactical gear and face coverings, just like the death squads in Central American banana republics. They're carrying guns, and they're invading neighborhoods to take people away. Those communities don't want people removed by force from their communities. They want left alone. But that's the point. That's what makes it payback. The fact that those people don't want this. You're dragging away respected and loved mothers and fathers, coaches, neighbors, workers, contributors to the social fabric of others' lives. You're invading communities and employing violence. Remember the phrase you used? An incomprehensible escalation of violence? That's what those people are experiencing and witnessing. An incomprehensible escalation of violence. I bring that to your attention, Todd, because you seem to be slightly nose-blind to the smell of your own farts here. Your violence is violence. You're deploying the most violent gang in America to peaceful communities to drag people away. I suggest to you that applying the principle of equal measure, of tit for tat, it would make sense that those who are offended by your violence against them might respond commensurately, that they might arm themselves, show up on your turf, maybe even drag some of your people away, just like your gang does to them. Not to attribute motives to those who arrived at Prairie Land on July 4th, but that does appear to be what was happening, a commensurate response. Although, not really. Just to be intellectually honest, a commensurate response to the hundreds of raids and ambushes your gang has committed would mean the attack and encirclement of dozens, if not hundreds, if not all, of your ICE facilities. I'm not advocating that. I'm just explaining to you that if that happens, Todd, it's because you've got it coming. There is an incomprehensible escalation in violence because you started it, your gang. I hope this open letter expands your personal capacity to smell your own farts. Hugs, anarchist prisoner, Sean Swain. So, that's my open letter, trying to educate a violent moron ruining thousands of lives per day and expressing confusion as to why people are mad. Feel free to share this. The phone number for ICE is 866-347-2423. That's 866-347-2423. They're also on X at IceGov. Try to explain to Todd what violence is. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.
J'avais oublié, nous sommes tous dans le même panier.